For our online visitors, you've tuned into the Wednesday night open classroom. My name is Ted Landsmark. I am director of the Dukakis Center on Urban and Regional Policy. I am co-teaching this class with Professor Jonathan Kaufman, the head of our journalism program. And tonight we present three speakers on issues of racism and ways of addressing some of the challenges that are being raised, even within our own region, and even recently as we see problems that have emerged within local towns and local school systems. So with that, who's going first? Diedra.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. When Professor Landsmark invited me to speak tonight, since then, that was like in the summer, since then I've been reflecting on the meaning of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think for me, at the fundamental, broadest level, the Black Lives Matter movement is about dismantling structures of bias and systemic structures that prevent Black people from living their fullest lives. And what that definition, for me at least, helps us do is think about, well, how can we in our everyday lives be a part of the movement or be furthering this cause? So I am Diedra Wrighting. I am the executive director of the Advanced Office of Faculty Development. And my question is, what are we doing? And on a daily basis, I ask myself, what am I doing? So the Advanced Office, and I say Advanced Office of Faculty Development at least once a day. And no one ever stops me and says, what in the world is that? Like, what is that? Some people think they know. They think it's advancement and that I raise funds. That is not the case. So Advance is a grant from the National Science Foundation. It's Advanced Institutional Transformation Grant. And in 2008, Northeastern received one of these prestigious awards. And from 2008 to 2015, the award was really focused on the advancement of women in engineering and science fields, particularly understanding the barriers to their career progression, as well as their representation. Since then, so a critical part of these transformation grants is once you have one, it's always there. The university makes a commitment up front to keep that grant going. So now, like fast forward all these years, I started in the office just 2 years ago, but instead of just being focused solely on women in engineering and science, the office has a broader scope of the entire faculty at Northeastern. So what are we doing? How do we do that? How do we understand what the faculty needs? So one part of that understanding is looking at inequality. And we understand what are the inequalities, what are the barriers that faculty face. We use data to figure those things out, and our data come from published work. So many people across the country are trying to figure out these same things. So we use their published work, but we also carry out our own surveys and interviews with faculty. And what we're hearing about the inequalities among Black faculty are vast. And just to kind of break them down, most faculty think about their lives in terms of where their work falls. Research, teaching, service, or teaching, research, service. And faculty have some percentage of these. If we look at research, for example, one major study was done in 2011 to show that Black scholars are twofold less likely to receive an NIH grant. So these people, they studied 80,000 grants. And they tried to control for everything, institution, anything you can think of. And the one factor that remained was race. So something about being Black was preventing these faculty from getting grants, prestigious grants. When we look at teaching, the situation is a little bit grayer. It's much more anecdotal, but I think one thing is clear, that student evaluations are inherently biased. So that's coming clear from the data. What is unclear is the source of those biases. Some people say that if you have a lot of charisma, you get better evaluations. Some people say if you're dressed better, you get better evaluations. Some people say that if you're Black, you're going to get worse evaluations. Like there's an assumption when you walk into the room that your credentials are not as good as your peers. Regardless of whether that's true, because the data are very muddled, I think the real issue is that as a Black faculty member, you don't know. So there's some faculty members that this is not a thought. Like it has no impact whatsoever. They walk in, if they get evaluations, they can use them to improve their teaching. But if you are a Black faculty member, you have to have this thing in the back of your head that says, is this really based solely on my teaching? Or is it, was I not nice enough? Or do people not have as much faith in my credibility, in my scholarship? The service aspect is another bind that Black faculty find themselves in because of several reasons, especially recently, right? After George Floyd's murder, a lot of universities are rolling out plans to make their universities better, which is wonderful. And they want their Black faculty, their faculty of color, to be involved in those plans. The thing is, there are fewer of them, so that is increasing their service load. That is already much higher than many faculty because they're fewer on campus at predominantly white institutions. They're sought out quite heavily by all students because of their identity. And faculty have complained that this is a barrier to them getting their work done, but they're not necessarily receiving credit for that extra service burden. So those are just some examples of the inequalities that exist among faculty, not just here at Northeastern, but across the nation. And I think I'll end by saying I'm very excited about entering a conversation with you about what we do about those things, because we certainly have not, we do some things, but we haven't cured them. Thank you.
Thank you, Diedra. I'm going to start by asking you to take a minute to think about the idea of home. Think about the house you lived in, you grew up in, and think about what that means to you. And so I'm not asking for you to think about the people you live with or like the sort of like touchy-feely idea of home, but the actual house that you grew up in and what that means. My name is LaBoy, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Architecture. So I think a lot about buildings. And I think about the relationship people have with buildings and with the built environment. I'm trained as an architect and as an engineer and as an urban planner. So I'm interested in the intersection of many scales of thinking about our built environment. And I have to say I'm humbled and honored that I was asked to come here. I'm not a scholar of the Black Lives Matter movement, but my work intersects with it, and I've been reflecting on it quite a bit because I study the way in which people transform their built environment and adapt to conditions of change in their built environment. Especially in one area of my research has to do with climate change and what we are expecting to be the effects of climate change on people in the built environment. And that disproportionately impacts people of color, especially, and that's globally, like poor countries, and poor neighborhoods in the United States, et cetera, which are very often aligned with race, migrant status, et cetera. And so a home, which, when you think about what a home is, it means something very different for each of you. Generally speaking, is made up of, you have structure, you have systems that give you heat and light and all of that. And you have, they give you comfort, and you have also a lot of memories in it. But generally speaking, we think about homes as shelter. And that is incredibly endangered in the coming decades. And what does that have to do with the Black Lives Matter movement? Well, the built environment is the embodiment of all the systems, the systemic racism in this country. And when you look at when we map out, as professionals, as researchers, we map out where climate change is going to have the highest impacts geographically, they tend to be also the alignment with communities of color, and especially the Black community. And the Black community is already suffering a history of being brutalized by the built environment. Black and brown bodies affected by systems of state-sponsored segregation, such as redlining, that basically FHA, did not want to insure mortgages in neighborhoods predominantly African American, and the inability of African Americans to purchase a home. And so when I asked you to think about home, I asked you to think about home because homes are, in America, as I forget, I should quote this person, but I forget who it was. I am on maternity leave, so I'm gonna give myself a break for forgetting names. But this person said it is it's actually the foundation of inequality in America. Because Americans believe their wealth, and this is very true in many cases, their wealth comes primarily from owning a home. And all of the systemic racism that prevented Black Americans from purchasing a home have meant generational wealth decreasing over a long time. And so to this day, the gap in home ownership between Blacks and whites is 30 percentage points, even with all of the efforts that have been made at trying to change that. And on top of that, you have African Americans and Latinos living in communities that are already, because of redlining and all of these effects, exposed to higher rates of asthma, higher rates of air pollution, food deserts, or what I recently read should be called food apartheid, and credit deserts, and all of these different factors of the physical environment, lack of urban canopy, so less trees, more asphalt, that have made their health significantly impacted simply by where they live. And that's something that you have to think about. What does that have to do with architecture? Well, I can tell you in my work, some of the research points to people really believing that their ability to prepare for climate change is directly tied to their ability to control their built environment, and they associate home ownership with the ability to make the changes that prepare them for climate change. And you can, sort of imagine the conversations that happen when people talk about landlords and like asking for improvements, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have to go there. And there's also the idea that you are dealing with the built environment that is mostly designed or not designed by architects. Single-family homes, two-family homes are, the let's just say architects have very little to do with designing that environment, and that has many complicated reasons. Because architects usually are a profession associated with systems of power. We design the homes, a very small percentage of homes, the homes of the elite, and we design, the civic buildings, et cetera, right? So we're not paying attention to how those homes are going to fare in climate change and with all of these changes coming, and we should. So we need to, I believe, our profession, planners, architects, need to not only come to terms with that history and to not repeat it, but actually actively work to dismantle and undo all of that damage that has been done. But to do that, we can't just go into those communities that are primarily communities of color with the way that our profession looks. Our profession is still predominantly white and male. And so where are the Black architects? I looked up some data on this. Only 2% of the licensed architects in the United States are Black. 1.5% men, 0.5% women. And that also adds all of the complications of women in the profession, and et cetera. They only make, and keep in mind, African Americans are 14% of the population in the country. So, 2% is very far from at least representing the population. But also, the majority of them are going to the historic Black universities. So that means that the majority of universities like ours has even a smaller percentage. And they are also going into more programs that are considered pre-professional, which means that they don't lead to the licensure for cost reasons and many other complicated reasons, which means a lifetime potentially of lower earnings as an architect. So we need those Black architects, and we need them working in addressing these issues of systemic racism in the built environment. And it has to start here, right? It has to start in our schools. Where are the Black students in architecture? And so I am the faculty mentor of the National Organization of Minority Architecture Students chapter at Northeastern, a wonderful group of students that represent the minorities in the profession in our school. And in 2020, in around May or June, maybe June, July, their president emailed me and said, after all of the events of George Floyd, she said, I want to, NOMAS, it's the acronym for the group, NOMAS wants to come to the forefront of this conversation in the School of Architecture. We want to lead this conversation. I was moved, inspired, because it's important that they did, but I could not think of a way of imposing that burden on them by asking, because at that time we were all dealing with a lot. And so I wanted to empower those students to do that, but I struggle, and I still struggle with how to empower the students to do that. And the result of them coming forward and taking leadership was that we had an amazing year, a lot of conversations. We had a speaker series, a panel series where the students designed the topics that we were going to talk about, and we searched, we worked together to find the speakers and bring them in and talk about these issues, very difficult issues, on all kinds of aspects of the built environment, accessibility, community engagement, et cetera, that have to do with addressing a lot of these social justice problems. And I wanted to leave that out there to sort of not only talk about the role of faculty, but the role really of students in changing a lot of these statistics and taking leadership in these issues. And I wanted to think, as a faculty member, I myself struggle, and I would like to pose this question to you all: how do we empower students to take that leadership, to take that initiative, without imposing it as a burden? So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much for the invitation. I look forward to speaking with all of you.
Hello again. I mentioned earlier, my name is Rebecca Riccio. I am the founder and Jafali Family Director of the Social Impact Lab, which has an academic affiliation with the Human Services Program. I also teach in the Policy School. I'm here as a social change educator and social activist. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that I am a middle-aged, cisgendered, heterosexual white woman of privilege. And so when I talk about social change, I want to make it clear that it is from that limited lens and lived experience. And so tonight, as I'm talking, following the amazing comments by Diedra and Michelle, I hope that I can contribute to a conversation about how can we continue to embody the values and vision of the Black Lives Matter movement. So it is not just a moment, but a movement that leads to cultural change. But I also want to acknowledge that from my perspective, I am most comfortable calling people to curiosity and engagement and self-reflection who, like me, are white people who have positions of power and privilege in the social change arena. I'd like to start by asking, how many of you have heard critiques or read case studies of situations in which white people have gone into other folks' communities to solve their problems with their great ideas, this notion of white savior? Can I see a show of hands? Right, we know about this phenomenon. There are case studies that abound by scholarships and community engaged teaching and research who can document the harm that folks from institutions of higher ed can, the harms that they can cause in communities and in their classrooms with students when they're not sensitive to the power dynamics, to what they're bringing into communities. There are plenty of examples from global development in which organizations from the global north have imposed solutions on the global south that are harmful. We know this. We have known this. And I would say it has been knowable for a very long time. The fact that we keep doing it is highly problematic. The question I want to ask tonight is, what have we learned to improve upon that very problematic track record, if anything, over the last 2 years since the pandemic, since the murder of George Floyd? And I want to start with another question. When you think about the poor stewardship that our generation has done in bequeathing your future to you, shout out, please. What are some of the urgent social challenges that are defining the things that are making you anxious and stressed out and one of the generations most plagued by mental health challenges ever? What are those challenges? And anybody, just go ahead and shout them out. What is your generation facing? Climate change? Keep going. Okay, wealth inequality, what else? Debt. I know NU Mutual Aid is collecting food because we have food insecurity on campus, housing insecurity, right? On and on. If we look at those social challenges, the things that the social change arena addresses, I find it very hard not to identify ones that don't disproportionately affect people of color and low-income communities, right? So we have this social change arena whose job it is, to which we have outsourced through the nonprofit sector and philanthropy and corporate social responsibility, the challenge of dealing with all of these issues, right? I think in the post-George Floyd murder era, in the era in which we're discussing how to embody Black Lives Matter so it leads to actual change, we need to be interrogating the very concept of the social change arena and asking how it is that so many of us have built this industry, this whole thing that with the sector that we teach about, around the notion that apparently not everybody is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we talk a lot about, well, how do we do the work of the nonprofit sector better? How do we engage more corporations in corporate social responsibility? But we don't actually look at the issue of power. You know, when we talk about social and racial injustice, it's not that these problems have just fallen out of the sky, you know, too bad, we've got to fix these things, right? They are a manifestation of imbalances of power. Who has it? Who doesn't have it? How do those who have it wield it? And so when we're looking at the social change arena, I find it really paradoxical that the people who are decision-making in this space, the people who are making the policies, the people who are gathering the most wealth and giving it away charitably, the people who are running the foundations, the people who are running the institutions of higher education and other anchor institutions whose community engagement is supposed to improve lives and communities, they don't look like those communities. That's a real problem. And so I don't know how it is that unless we grapple with that, with white privilege in the social change arena, how can we possibly begin to harness all those resources and all that effort and all that knowledge to change, to address social challenges that predominantly and disproportionately affect people of color? How can we unpack systems of oppression if we don't understand our own role in them? And I just really quickly want to ask you to imagine an iceberg, right? This is a quick lesson in how systems come to be. Imagine the top of that iceberg is all of those problems that you named, right? What we can see. Housing insecurity, food insecurity, climate change, and. Where is that coming from? They're the product of churning right underneath the water, of the policies, the laws, the budget making, the decision making, the HR practices, the insurance policies that can make it possible for someone to lose their job through no fault of their own and therefore lose their insurance and therefore have no access to mental health care and therefore end up homeless and in the streets. So where do those come from? Well, you go down one next layer in the iceberg, and that's where the institutions and the organizations are, right? The places that these decisions are being made, that these policies are being made. We think, oh, man, the system's broken. But who is in those places? That's the next layer on the iceberg, and that's where people are bringing our biases and the limits of our lived experiences, our cultural orientations into the bottom of the iceberg. We are the ones making those institutions that are causing the churning that is leading to the top of the iceberg. And so you don't have to enter that system. You don't have to enter those spaces consciously anti-racist or going in with the intention to build systems of oppression. You just bring in your own baggage, your own awareness, right? And if that happens to be a bunch of people who share a certain identity sitting around the table making those decisions, what happens? Without intending to, you start to build systems that advantage the people whose lived experience is similar to yours, and without even realizing it, you disadvantage people who don't. And so what's interesting about this is that we build the system from the bottom up, but then those manifestations at the top shape who we are, right? And in systems, we talk about reinforcing loops a lot, right? This is how we both shape and are shaped by systems. And I find it interesting that we're at the bottom of the iceberg because we're like the fish who don't know that we're swimming in water. Because all of us are swimming in this water of a dominant culture that is white and patriarchal and heteronormative. And so all of us are shaped by that. Right? And so once you know that, and this is the challenge that I would make to all of us in the social change arena, but especially those of us who are white and whose identity is very dominant in shaping that iceberg and shaping that system, is I don't think it's possible for us to engage in social change, to claim to be advocates of social and racial justice, unless we understand, unless we grapple with our own racial identity. And this goes beyond reading the right books and doing the trainings and understanding diversity and equity and inclusion. All of that is necessary, but it is not sufficient because it is too easy to reduce that to a checklist, right? It's too easy to externalize that, to say, well, these are the things that I can do in my space. And that can very easily become performative. I think sometimes that's even worse than not doing anything at all, because then you can pat yourself on the back and say, I'm part of the solution here, I'm fixing things. Where what we really need to be doing is the work inside and embracing a journey of anti-racism and anti-oppression. And that is not an easy journey. It's not one that ever ends. It is a praxis
right? It is a way of engaging in and with community to learn. It is about building relationships. It is about accountability. And it is about the joy of doing that. Because in doing that, and when you start to unpack the ways we have been shaped by that system, by that water we're swimming in, we can reconnect with the humanity and with the people who that system has separated us from. And that is where the joy comes from, and that is where the hope comes from, even as the journey itself can be painful and difficult.
Oh, hello.
Hi, Danae, you're there. Can you hear me?
Hi, guys.
Danae is a alumnus of the journalism school, a recent alumnus. When did you graduate?
2020.
Okay, 2020. So for her first job, she's working in Savannah, Georgia for local television there and is covering the Ahmaud Arbery trial. Could you just kind of fill people in briefly about the trial, what's going on, and kind of where things stand? Because it's been a while since it was in the news.
Yeah, definitely. There's been a lot that's been going on too. So the state trial started about three going on 4 weeks ago. And so we had opening statements, and then the state went on to do their witness testimony. That wrapped up yesterday. So today actually was the first day of defense witness testimony, as well as one of the defendants, William Roddy Bryan's attorney, did his opening statement. He elected to do his after the state rested their case.
And what are the defendants charged with? What's the incident?
Yeah, so they are charged with a total of 9 counts. They're essentially, to sum it up, they're charged with murdering Ahmaud Arbery in February of 2020. It was a very viral video. He was jogging through a Brunswick neighborhood. This happened in Brunswick, Georgia. He was jogging through the neighborhood, and there was a video that was released of Travis McMichael and Gregory McMichael, the son and father, chasing Arbery down the street in their pickup trucks. And then at the end of the video, they're seen shooting him with a shotgun 3 times, ultimately killing him.
So what's it like for you covering it as a journalist, but also as a journalist of color and as a kind of, let's call it the post-George Floyd generation of journalists?
Yeah, so it's very interesting covering this case, especially given the fact that when the video came out, I was in college. So I was a journalist, obviously. I think people in college are still able to call themselves journalists, but I wasn't working, obviously. So being on the case now and having to try to remain as impartial and unbiased as possible, even though I absolutely had opinions about the case when it first happened, seeing it in the news and everything. I think everyone had a visceral reaction to the video. So covering it now, it's very interesting to see kind of the inner workings. Also, this is my first court case that I've ever covered. I graduated only a year and a half ago. So for the first court case that I'm in-depthly covering, being such a national big story is quite the learning curve, because there's just, court can be very bureaucratic and there's a lot going on all the time. So I'm kind of learning as I'm going. But I will say, number one, I think the consensus from the community out here, as well as my bosses, is there isn't a question of if they killed him. We know that he killed him. So in the language that I use in my own scripts, we're able to say things like murdered, killers, things of that nature, which I think would be something that you run into an issue with if there wasn't a video of what happened. And so the language, I feel like it's pretty easy to stay straight and narrow, just because this isn't a question of if they killed him. Like, we know that they killed him. So I feel like that kind of helps me out trying to figure out how exactly to remain as impartial as possible in my own coverage of the event. So
what is the dispute? What's the defense claiming?
So the defense is claiming that they used self-defense. Here in Georgia, there was this citizen's arrest law that's now actually been overhauled. It's no longer a law in Georgia because of this case. But they were claiming that they were trying to perform a citizen's arrest on Ahmaud Arbery because they believed that he was stealing, entering into a under construction home. So this home had no doors, no windows. It was very much just a blank shell of a house. And they believe that he was stealing from it. There had been some petty crime incidents in the neighborhood over the past year prior to this happening. Nothing super serious, just like car break-ins. And there were only 4 reports, I believe, in 1 year from that neighborhood. But so they believe that Ahmaud Arbery had been this man that they had saw on surveillance video entering this home. And then so Gregory and Travis McMichael saw, or I guess a neighbor came out, said that there was someone in the house. Travis and Gregory McMichael decided to get in their truck and go start chasing after him. And in Travis's testimony today, he said that he was trying to stop him and talk to him to ask what he was doing. And the interesting thing is, though, they're claiming self-defense and they're claiming citizen's arrest, but the home that was under construction didn't belong to the McMichaels. It belonged to someone named Larry English, who didn't live at the house. So there's a lot of levels to it, because the state is trying to say, how can you claim self-defense if you're not defending something that is in your, like, that doesn't belong to you?
So you grew up outside of Boston, right, in Bedford? And then
yeah, well, I went to high school at Bedford, yeah.
Okay, and then you you lived in the Northeastern bubble, and now you're in Georgia. And we've been reading a lot about Georgia, not just about this trial, but about voter suppression and, all the kind of things that are filling the news. What's that like, again, as a young person who's, been a Northeasterner and as a woman of color?
Yeah, it's definitely really interesting. Luckily, I come from a military family background, so I'm pretty used to having to pick up and move to completely foreign situations for myself. I lived in Hawaii for a little bit, Japan for a little bit, Georgia actually for a little bit as well, and then I moved up to Massachusetts for 6 to 7 years. So there was definitely like a minor culture shock at the beginning, but I don't know. I guess I'm just used to it. But it is interesting seeing the issues in the news that are issues down here versus what's in the news up north in Boston. Especially something like the citizen's arrest law. I feel like it's a really good example of kind of the culture in flux here, because it's an extremely old law. It's a relic of the civil war.
This is the citizen's arrest law, you said?
Yeah, the citizen's arrest law. It's kind of a relic of the past. And so a lot of things are getting overhauled here in the South. And there's a constant fight between younger people and the younger generation wanting to be more progressive and wanting more progressive, politicians and laws and bills and things of that nature. But the state is mostly controlled by Republicans. It's still Republican, even though the senators from here are Democrats. That was kind of, that was not expected by anyone. But on the state level, the governor is still a Republican. Everyone actually on the upper echelons of like Georgia, the political sphere, are all Republicans. So there's a constant tug and pull. But it's going to be interesting here in the next couple of years, I think, especially with the gubernatorial race coming up. There's a lot of things in question, and people are going to see, is Georgia truly flipping to be blue, or was this just kind of an anti-Trump election that happened in 2020?
Let me just ask the students if they have any questions. I can pass them the microphone. Hold on, Danae.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Danae. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Hi. My name is Robert. I actually grew up in Georgia, and I was really curious of your experience being there, working and having lived there in the past. I find that oftentimes people in the Northeast and in the Northeastern bubble refer to Georgia as we had talked about, this foreign country, this place that, is beyond salvation, this place that is just almost lawless. And I was curious to hear your impressions of, how people perceive the South, or Georgia specifically, from your time living either in the Northeast or in Hawaii or elsewhere versus actually kind of being on the ground. How does that compare from your lens?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, coming from New England, people, I definitely absolutely have that idea of the South and Georgia of being uneducated, uninformed, and just kind of stuck in their ways from 50, 60, 70 years ago. But I don't think that's a fair indictment of the people who live in the state in the moment, even the people who are in these more rural areas like Brunswick. If you were to go out on the street in Brunswick and ask if what the McMichaels did was wrong, most people would tell you, yeah. And that's white people, black people, that's everyone. I would say I've been out here in Brunswick covering this case for the past 3 to 4 weeks, and I haven't seen a single person protesting outside, say, like, for the McMichaels, which I think is huge, seeing as the family has lived here for the past 50, 60 years. They're very well known here. So I don't think it's a fair indictment because, number one, there's a lot of young people moving to places, especially Atlanta. The metro Atlanta area has been absolutely booming recently. So there is a lot of movement in terms of what I guess the general idea is here in terms of cultural norms. Also, you can see politicians who are acknowledging that a lot of the rules and laws in place here in Georgia aren't fair or shouldn't be in place anymore. And I think, not to reference it again, but the citizens arrest law being overhauled. That was something that Democrats and Republicans all agreed on after they saw the video of Ahmaud Arbery getting shot. And the governor ultimately signed a bill overhauling that law. I don't think you could say that that would have happened 10 years ago. And I think it's a really good, I think it's an indication that the state is trying to, I guess, amend or correct things that might have gone on in the past that people would say aren't, fair or aren't right. So I think people down here are they're regular people. Like, they're just like people up north. It's just, they might just have a different way of thinking, but I don't think that means that they're backwards or stuck in the 70s or anything like that. They're just trying to live a life and be comfortable,
Any other questions? What's your political prediction about what's going to happen in Georgia? I guess, is it Warnock who's going to be up for re-election first?
Yeah, Warnock is coming up, and then the governor's race is also coming up.
And is Stacey Abrams going to run for something?
We don't know. A lot of people are thinking actually, I won't even say a lot of people. I would say it's pretty 50-50 about whether or not Stacey Abrams will run, but someone like Stacey Abrams will likely run.
And so any last pieces of advice? You were a student, as you point out, just like, a year and a half ago, and now you're on this kind of rocket ship. Any advice about what it's like when you leave here and how to figure out the opportunities and navigate them?
Yeah, so piece of advice number one is it happens really quickly. If you told me when I was, in college, in Professor Kaufman's class, like 1 to 2 years ago, that I'd be covering one of the biggest national stories to be happening in 2021, I would have laughed in your face. I would have never thought that it would have been possible to be in Brunswick, Georgia, covering this case right now. But just because we're young or just because you don't have the most experience compared to everyone else in the field, that's not indicative of the type of stories you're able to cover. I feel like Northeastern University and the journalism program gives us such a good foundation to be able to go into these situations and these scenarios to do stories that are, everyone's talking about and that are the biggest stories in the nation, and be able to hold our own in the field. I'm out here having to rub shoulders with like national CNN reporters and NBC reporters and ABC reporters, and I'm still having to ask, the hard-hitting questions to the defense attorneys when they come out, and ask questions to the Arbery family about, what is it like seeing your son getting shot in court, 5 times a day? Like, I'm having to ask those questions and trying to ask them ahead of these national correspondents. So I would say Northeastern gives you such a good foundation to be able to do stuff like that. So take as many classes as you can and learn as much as you can while you're there. And also, being in school in Boston is amazing. There's so many opportunities within the city of Boston, which I'm sure you all know. The Boston Globe has so many co-ops and internship programs. All of the local TV stations have such great job opportunities. I was a news writer at WHDH, which I think is one of the best things I could have done for myself while I was in college in Boston. Just because it gave me a really good foundation to be able to write quickly and think quickly on my feet when writing my scripts. So I feel like Northeastern puts us in a very unique situation that a lot of students don't necessarily have when they are in college, to be able to immediately come out from college, whether it's immediately be an asset to whatever newsroom you're in. I don't know if that answered your question. I can't remember what your question was now. I feel like I'm like hyping up Northeastern now.
You did a great job. We're going to turn it into a commercial.
Okay.
Well, Danae, thanks a lot. I know you've had a long day, so we're going to let you go. But please come visit us up here in person. And thanks for joining us. Good luck.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into any kind of focused conversation among the panelists, this is really the first time we've talked about Black Lives Matter and related matters. And before we start a conversation, I want to hear from students to make sure that we cover all of the things you want to cover in tonight's class. So are there specific things you want to make sure we touch upon in our conversations? Robert?
Hello. I'm an international student from China. My question about the STEM and racism is more of if that's a problem, if that's a problem aside from the outside force of social structure, what can students or high school students, potentially being college students, can do to combat this kind of problem?
Okay. Others? We're not going to answer that immediately. I want to
Okay.
hear all the questions first. Yeah, Robert? Hang on. Let's get a mic to you.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear how just how like education and being an educator has changed after the summer of 2020, particularly people who, you know, I feel like I've heard a lot of people saying I really reflected after George Floyd, but there were issues of racism and, you know, inequity before George Floyd. Um, like how did the industry change, and then how do you sort of backtrack conversations with like, okay, you know, why did you choose to wake up to this now instead of, you know, previously?
Yeah, we heard some different, there were different points made from all three speakers, like about what does it mean to call in students to the conversation without placing the burden on them, or also placing the burden on faculty of color. So one solution I've heard is like monetary compensation, and Northeastern has lots of funding and how that gets allocated. So I'm curious of like, what are the ethics of like, how do we pay people for their work? And like, is that actually like the solution is to pay students and faculty more when they contribute to these conversations?
Okay.
Hello, thank you so much for speaking with us. I just had a specific question for Ms. Wrighting, and I'm wondering if your office looks at informal professor rating websites like Rate My Professor, and whether there are any inequalities there.
Wait for the mic, please.
I know we're talking about a lot about George Floyd case here. As a student from journalism major, I want to ask how many people have watched the full 45 minutes of the police body camera of that case? Is that clear? Like, so how many people have watched the 45 minutes of the police officer body camera when that George Floyd case happened?
Yeah, it looks like almost no one has.
No one has? That's just my own curiosity.
Okay.
Like how many of us have watched the full camera?
Yeah, well, what's the point? What do you think we would see if we did?
Nothing. I'll say that later, maybe.
Okay. Anyone else with issues you want to make sure we cover? Yeah.
For the School of Architecture, does changing the structures of buildings and houses in so-called ghettos around inner cities change the conditions or that people usually associate with ghettos? So in a sense, does it alleviate some of the issues that we see in underserved communities?
So let's start with that question. To what extent does changing a physical environment change the social conditions of disenfranchisement, isolation, etc.?
Well, I started by mentioning homes as an example of the built environment, but I want to clarify that there are many aspects of the built environment that need to be addressed in order to really address many of the conditions that the built environment sort of it augments or amplifies many of the injustices that exist in the entire system of loss and social situations and cultures, et cetera. So it's not, the built environment is not the only avenue to do that, and it can never be the only way to do that. But I think what I was trying to point to were health, specifically health outcomes. And there are other types of outcomes, but when you address issues of fundamentally, safety, health, and I'm talking about I guess you could say they're like the indicators when you look at the built environment that are more likely to result in people being ill, in people being negatively impacted by, say, a climate event like a hurricane or a heat wave or any of the sort of common climate-related events that can cause damage, but that are more damaging in communities that have systemically been disinvested in, neglected, or excluded from the processes and systems of support that make other communities suffer less, right? So we start at a basic level with health. That is a huge and important aspect to address. And when you think about COVID and you look at the number of severe illness and hospitalizations and deaths in the Black community, that in itself is there's a direct link between disinvestment, exclusion, neglect in the built environment and the types of health conditions that lead to worse outcomes in COVID. So yes, there are things that we need to do in the built environment to address some just basic fundamental questions of safety and health and welfare for everyone, right? But I don't think it's ever going to be the only solution to that. It has to be part of an entire system of economic, social, political action that needs to take place, for that to take place. And it never happens, and then none of these things ever happen in isolation. They sort of support each other, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my...
Well, I'll take a step beyond that. There's ample evidence, even here in Boston, some of it within walking distance of here, of developments that have been built for people of limited economic means, poor people, where improving the physical environment demonstrated, among other things, that poor people, if given the resources, will keep that improved environment up. They will maintain it. It's not like being poor means that you run down the property that you're in, as long as you have the resources to maintain the landscaping and the plumbing and the roofing and what have you. Secondly, and I'll name specific places, the Mission Park Housing Development down the street on Huntington Avenue, Villa Victoria in the South End, the work that the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative has done in and around Dudley Street. All of those are Roxbury projects. And the same has happened in developments I've seen in East Boston and in Cambridge and in Brockton, where in providing well-maintained physical improvements has improved not only the immediate quality of life and the health conditions, but also raises the aspiration levels of young people who are growing up in those developments in ways where they see a different kind of future for themselves. And I would encourage you to visit any of the developments I've named or others I can think of where that kind of physical improvement made a difference. Changing neighborhood designs, 15-minute walkable neighborhoods, for example, and having schools that are proximate, changing the streetscape so that it's safer. For example, across the South, there are communities that have been built up without sidewalks. And simply putting sidewalks in and making it possible for people to walk to shopping has changed the prospects for people of limited economic means so that they can live better and access services better than under circumstances where they have to go out and get in a car and drive somewhere. So there is evidence, ample evidence, that simply improving the physical condition is a start towards improving social conditions and educational conditions and other sets of conditions. If we didn't believe that, and if we didn't have evidence of that, then there'd be no point in training architects to design for people of limited economic means. Architects would continue to do what they do now primarily, which is to design for wealthy people and for corporations. And part of what we've tried to address, at least in some design schools, is the fact that when you're designing for not just a young wealthy person who's usually white. You're also designing for children and seniors and people with disabilities and people of limited economic means, and that to the extent that architects think along those lines, they also then begin to design for resilience and for less exposure to negative environmental circumstances, and for cleaner water, and for a range of other environmental factors that improve the quality of life for not only the people in those communities, but for the people who pass through those communities, and for the people who are serviced at one level or another by the people who live in those communities. And by that I mean when the folks in East Boston who clean airplanes overnight live in better conditions in East Boston, the entire community is improved because of higher living conditions for the poor people who are cleaning those airplanes.
I also wanted to add, these are great points. And Ted used the word evidence. There is this idea called evidence-based design. That is, that we apply principles of design based on empirical evidence of how the built environment impacts people. And there are many, many statistics that you will hear if you just look that up on healthcare, for example, and hospitals and recovery, on schools in terms of student performance and how they do in cognitive development, or how they do in testing, if they have daylight versus if they don't, if they have natural ventilation versus if they don't, if they have access to views of greenery. That seems so minimal, but it actually has a dramatic impact in stress levels. And we talk about mental health issues, and it also disproportionately impacts certain groups who are obviously under more stressful conditions. So addressing the environment has the ability to allow people to at least have a chance of mitigating some of the effects that their social conditions might be creating. So there are many ways in which the built environment can affect mental health, physical health, and aspirational, educational outcomes, etc. So it is worth doing, and it is important to do it. And it's important to make the investments in those places. And when I talked about homes, I forgot to mention this, but in the United States, one of the biggest reasons for inequality are schools, which are directly tied in most places to home property taxes. So again, the kind of homes that you live in and where you live determines the kind of schools that you get. So it's all tied together. These are systematic problems. And so you address, you cannot address one thing, just one thing. You cannot just fix a house and you fixed all of those problems. You have to address all of those systemic problems and you have to recognize the connections between them.
Let me ask a question of Diedra. And it relates to this and other universities. You are a part of the university that is trying to help faculty to be better faculty. Not so much in teaching the subject matter, but in being good teachers. So one of the issues that comes up around race and inclusion and acceptance is the faculty member who is involved with microaggressions against students, insulting them, abusing, hurting students in the course of teaching. Does your program begin to deal with those kinds of issues? And if so, how? What are the curatives that can be put in place to help faculty, and by extension, any coworker or employer or person in a power position in an employment situation? What are the things that can be done to enable those people to be better and to avoid the kinds of microaggressions that often happen?
Right. I think that, as with most things, begins with awareness. So one thing that we definitely do is, and we actually had one this last semester, is a workshop about microaggressions from a person that is more like a practitioner. So a person who teaches people how to and studies microaggressions. So it's not like I go out and give that. We try to bring in an expert. So raise awareness is not enough. I think it goes a long way. One other thing, so I do have in a student-facing role in some capacity. And I think empowering students is another part of that. So both sides of the equation. So what do you, as a student, when a microaggression occurs, what do you do? How are you empowered? Does that mean there's a narrative that you need to adopt to be able to unpack that and deal with it? Does that mean that there are words that you have available to you that you feel empowered to use to meet that person kind of halfway in terms of raising their awareness about the situation? So those are two ways that I can impact from my own office. But I think there's more to it. Like, that doesn't, like you were saying, Rebecca, we can read all the books, we can know all of the things, but what's actually going to have a cultural change where people are doing and not just knowing?
I'd like to add to that, and thank you for the work that your office does, by the way. It is so important, and I know that over the past year, the demands on faculty of color have been enormous, and that a lot of folks who've been associated with this series have been asked to carry a heavy load. Getting to the question, to Ted's question, I just want to give a shout out to another office on campus called the Center for Advancing Teaching and Learning Through Research, which collaborates with Advance and other units on campus around making us better educators, right? So this is something that's really important to know. We have resources on campus to make us better educators. And so where the awareness comes in is taking responsibility, building our awareness, looking at the world around us, looking at the students in our classrooms, and recognizing that the harms we perpetrate as educators begin in the classroom when we're not attuned to our power and our relationships and students' relationships to the issues we're talking about and to what's happening in the world. And there is copious information about how to be an anti-racist teacher. There is anti-racist pedagogy, anti-oppressive pedagogy. And this is what we mean when we talk about praxis, when we talk about making a commitment to doing this work and seeking out the opportunities to learn to do better, reflecting on your experience, know you're going to make mistakes, and then try again and keep doing that. And so I would like us to all assume responsibility for making our fellow colleagues aware that we have the opportunities on campus to do that better, and I think we owe it to our students.
I wanted to pick up on Robert's question, which I think is an important one. And I'd like you to answer it also from a personal perspective, not just an institutional one. Why did it take George Floyd in 2020 to galvanize people? I mean, it's not like, I mean, certainly even in the era of area of police violence, you know, there had been Eric Garner, there had been Breonna Taylor. You know, we have had riots, we elected a black president. It's not like this has been an issue that has been a surprise to people. And I think it's an interesting question, which is, what was it, and what does that say about the country and about us personally? And is it possible that this will all fade away in a couple of years and we'll kind of go back to the way things were and wait for the next outrage?
Okay. That's a really good question. I think some people would say that, you know, it was going on. Like, for example, my office existed. There were things happening, but the profile is right. So what is that? And I think for me, the difference is that there's a lot of top movement, like a lot of what, like my office, we are part of the Office of the Provost, but because it's a faculty-centered, it feels very grassroots. You know, what do faculty need? What are faculty doing? Very in the trenches. But the difference for me was, you know, now there's President Aoun has a call to action, and you can go to the website and see it. And many university presidents have this, and like statements were made, and those statements were critiqued. I don't know if you know this, but there's a group of students who collected all of the critiques, all of the statements, and critiqued them all and ranked them. So if I
Michelle, were you involved in that? Was that? Okay.
So that was pretty cool, because then people are very much under the microscope for their response and their actions. And I don't, that feels new to me. Like, I feel like people did things or didn't, but it's new. And from a personal perspective, I think this, like, what are you doing? You must be doing. We're judging you for what you're doing. Is people are taking that seriously. And I remember, so I read a magazine, Real Simple, and I was just, you know, eating my lunch, reading it, and there's a part that's like products, whatever. There was a hair care product, and I'm like, this product is for my hair. Only. Like, there's no other person who would use that product. And I realized I had never seen something like that in a mainstream magazine, that was just for me. And I was just stunned. So those are the type of changes that are going on. I haven't answered your question. I don't know. It's just this, it's visible, and people are held accountable for what they're doing or not doing. But I'm waiting for it to go away. So, like, when is it going to stop?
I think there are others on the panel who want to react to that, and so do I.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say I worry about that. You know, I organized a social justice and design lecture series in 2017, And it was very successful, and the students were very inspired, but it was very faculty-led. And that same group of students, casually, they were in first year when that event happened, are the same students who reached out to me in 2020 and said, we're ready to come forward and lead this conversation. And I think what changed was that even though the conversations were happening, the events were happening, I think the power dynamics changed. Now students are, leading and sort of designing these events with us in a way that I don't think will go back, at least not as long as I am involved. And because I think the outcomes were so much more powerful. And the conversations were so much more meaningful. And the participation from the students was so much more relevant and impactful and moving and all of the important things. And so I think that transforms the people who are there. And I hope we don't forget. I do think that there are galvanizing moments. I think about, I was in my first semester in grad school on September 11th of 2001. That changed everything about architecture and everything that we know. There are certain things in our lives that really shift things in a way that we may not think about 9/11 anymore, but there are certain things that never went back to the way they were after. Sometimes for the worse, but we have to recognize that. So I do think that was a very impactful moment. For me personally, it was just something that I knew happened, but seeing it as a new mom, hearing him say, call for his mother and all that, each one of us had a very personal reaction to it that was very, I think, transformative. And I hope it doesn't change, but I do worry that we will eventually kind of forget and go back to business as usual. So I think we have to hold each other accountable. I think students have to hold the faculty accountable, and they have to hold the university accountable. And we have to, everybody has to be looking up and saying, hey, you said this 10 years ago. Let's check on this. I'm encouraged by the fact that I have now a lot of faculty of color as colleagues in the School of Architecture. I used to be the only one. And I now want to make sure that they get the support they need to succeed, because I want them to get tenured and to stay with us for, 30, 40 years. So, but I'm encouraged by the fact that there's a lot more, diversity in our faculty that is bringing certain issues really higher into priority.
I think that historians and sociologists and psychologists and educators are going to be examining the events of the last few years for a long time to figure out, God, what were they thinking and what happened? Like, how can some of this have come to pass? And so I look at a couple of different events. I think that there's an interesting relationship between COVID and Black Lives Matter, in that we were already primed to see, you could not help but see that the people who were dying from COVID were the people who were on the front lines, and the people in low-income, highly dense communities who were people of color. Like, you could not be paying attention to COVID. You could not be paying attention to COVID because a lot of people were stuck at home with not much to do but pay attention to the news and social media and all of that. The folks who weren't on the front lines, the people who were privileged to be home. And so you're already sensitized. There's something happening here that's not okay. And then, even though we didn't all watch the whole 45 minutes, how many people watched the 8+ minutes of the actual murder of George Floyd, right? Over and over again. That, unlike many of the other horrific murders that happened, folks were home watching social media and understanding that it is possible for a human being to be killed in real time in a live stream by a cop, right? Like, that was a new thing. So the relationship between COVID and Black Lives Matter, interesting. I also think that Parkland actually has something to do with it, because it was such an interesting, as somebody who supports youth activists and is in the streets often with youth activists, the organizing skills that young people started to develop in the era of Parkland. Can I see hands raised? How many of you in middle school or high school had some involvement with that, right? the level of sophistication of youth activism right now is extraordinary to me. And I think many of you could be teaching courses on social movement building because the way you're doing, like, you just know how to do this stuff. It's so impressive to me. So there's this generation of young people who have come up through Parkland who are now also at home, not going to school. Who's in the streets? Who's organizing? Young people who have had that experience. So I think that's also really important. And then this issue of visibility and accountability. What I'm concerned about is that it's not coming from a place of values all the time so much as a place of brand recognition, that like you have to do this now, like this is part of what it means to be a good corporate social responsibility, whatever is in part of your brand, and all of that is about doing this stuff, and that we can turn it into a performative checklist as opposed to an authentic change in values. And that's where accountability comes into play. And this is where we're going to put the pressure back on you again around the accountability, around the staying involved, staying in the streets, remaining active, and staying involved in politics, as depressing and demoralizing as that may be. We need more of you having more of the power.
I think the activism at this moment is driven really by a progressive reaction against Donald Trump. And what Trump surprisingly to many progressives represented of American values. The bad things that we're talking about, George Floyd and what have you, all of those things have gone on in this country for decades and generations and centuries. There's nothing new about them. Scottsboro and any of a range of horrible activities that have gone on for a long time. They're not new. So the question is, why is the reaction what it is at this moment? And why is there a mobilization against these horrible things? And, you know, for those of us who did go through the civil rights movement, there was activism on virtually every campus in the country. And college presidents spoke out. We knew who they were, Kingman Brewster and Reverend Hesburgh and other people. There was leadership on our campuses. And a lot of the leadership, to get to the question that was asked earlier, a lot of the leadership came from students who were outraged at the bad things that were going on in the country. And as victories started to be won, public accommodations, voting rights, Black elected officials, improvements in healthcare, new housing being built, progressives got complacent. It was as though every 2 or 3 years there'd be a major breakthrough. Same-sex marriage. Oh, okay. Abortion rights protected. Oh, okay. Money going into CDCs to do community improvements. Oh, okay. General acceptance of transgender rights. Oh, okay. We just took one victory after another, as though that was the upward path of humanity that seemed inevitable. And so the demonstrations stopped. The activism stopped. The organizing, except in small segments, stopped. And people got really complacent. Conservatives throughout that period continued to organize. They organized on the school committee level. They organized on the county level. They organized in corporations. They organized in the courts. In this open classroom, we've brought in people, conservatives, who can describe very accurately how they've been organizing for 30 years for this moment. And so when Trump got elected, it wasn't so much Trump per se that shocked people. It was the fact that so many Americans voted for him that shocked people. They were stunned that there was this thing going on across America that wasn't just a momentary movement. It had been there, festering and growing for a long time. And it was a movement that justified going out and shooting people. It was a movement that said anyone can go out with a gun and say that they're protecting someone else's property and kill a person, and that that was okay. And it was a movement that said that many of the victories that progressive thought they had won were Pyrrhic, that they were temporary, that they were transitional, that they could be taken away at any moment. And so when the George Floyd videos and the others became a lot more visible, everyone said, oh, this is a horrible thing, we need to mobilize again. But the equivalent of George Floyd videos have always been there. I mean, as a kid growing up in Harlem, I remember getting copies of the Amsterdam News, the black newspaper in the neighborhood, in the community, the so-called Black Dispatch, and seeing pictures of people who'd been lynched in the South. And those were as horrible as the George Floyd video was. But we got complacent, and we thought everything is fine. And on campuses, the organizing around a bunch of issues had stopped. Not just for a period of a couple of years, it had stopped for 20 years. It had stopped for 25 years. And when we realized that what was going on with the Trump supporters, or in a community like Danvers, where there still has not been a real planned reaction to racism and anti-Semitism, only a letter of apology saying, oh, gee, we're sorry that happened, but we can't tell you what we're going to do, people started to organize. And I don't think there's any question but that the organizational power of students has to continue. And one of the fundamental differences that exist, I think, between then and now, then 30 years ago, 40 years ago, was that 30 or 40 years ago, being in college had less to do with being a careerist, where you were afraid that if you went out and demonstrated, you'd get arrested and then you wouldn't have a chance at a job, which is clearly what drives a lot of students on a lot of campuses at this moment. I can't afford to take a risk because if I do, I won't get employed. Someone will read my social media and it'll turn up no matter what I say on my resume, and I'm going to be out of work, and the investment that I've made to get through college won't have a payoff. And as long as folks are afraid to take the risk of standing up for the values they believe in, then there is a very real risk that this is a moment and that it will go away in 3 or 4 years. Because again, we'll get used to an administration with a woman as a vice president and a mayor of Boston who's a woman of color, and we'll say, oh, we're back on the path towards progressive change. We don't need to keep organizing. And the moment we stop organizing, the kind of negative forces of racism and sexism and anti-Semitism will then reappear. I hope that answers the question of what students can do. Students can be organized and must organize themselves, and then students have to hold the rest of us accountable, given that we do in fact have power and authority to enact policies. And then jointly, we can bring about positive changes.
I'm wondering how the students feel about that. So now, in addition to doing well in your classes, getting a job, trying to keep your debt low, and dealing with the fact that climate change may make all this irrelevant, we now want you to kind of hold us accountable, organize, march in the streets, and get home for Thanksgiving. I mean, how does that feel to students? I'm kind of wondering. Anybody pissed off about that? Push it up.
Hello. So for me, I mean, I'm graduating in December, so it's kind of feels like a little too late. Like I don't have enough time even to participate in that. I'm doing what I can, but it's like I'm not going to physically be in Boston in a matter of like weeks, so it's kind of difficult in that instance. But I do have a friend that I was speaking to today, who's a student leader in the Asian American community, and she was just like so tired. And I think that's a big thing. Like at this point, there's a lot of burnout already, which I think is a big roadblock and a big issue that we're going to have to address moving forward.
Emma, right behind you.
I would like echo what you just said. I think for me personally, I am burnt out, so I want to do like research or do something that helps facilitate the people that do have the energy to like go out. But I think at the same time, it isn't for everyone. I did like march for Black Lives Matter and everything like that, and I mean, it actually wasn't even that like draining. I actually found it very inspiring to look at the crowd and see who's there. But obviously, that was like a kind of positive experience. So I think with the discussion of mental health and everything like that, like people can also prioritize their health and know that like that it isn't for everyone, and participate in different ways, I think.
I think most students definitely feel a bit drained out or tired by it. I also do think it's interesting how it's not entirely a new phenomenon. Like we see like in the 60s, there was like this whole surge of protests in universities. We saw like I think how stuff like protests against like the Vietnam War and stuff like that started was actually in universities. Like I think Kent State, that whole incident. So I definitely think it's interesting how it's been common in the last like 50 years for universities and students to almost be the inception of many protests and a stronghold for like civil rights. So I think there is a tiredness with students, but it's probably been there for a long time as well. So I don't know how to fix that.
Sorry. To answer your question, it is exhausting, but like Dr. Landsmark was saying, it makes it easier when whatever coalition or group you're working with is organized well. At my last institution, we were working like 40 to 50 hours a day after George Floyd happened, in order to get certain policies passed, in order to get grants, in order to change the institution as a whole rather than just creating programming. And for me personally, I found that because I had a group of other dedicated students around who could help when I was going through it, that added a lot to it. And also with our new generation, a lot of us are conscious of that burnout. So doing activities or programming that allow us to do self-check-ins, that's important as well. And one thing that I ensured that I did was, once I graduated, I did not want anybody else to pick up that burden of doing that work without getting paid for it. Because on a lot of campuses, student governments get paid, yet we were doing twice or three times the work that they were doing. So right now, anybody that works for the organization that we founded in my last institution gets paid like $2,000 per semester. And that's an incentive to keep doing the work that you're doing. Also, just appreciating the small victories, because it's not always going to be big things that you're changing. But it is exhausting. It's just the same way that your work is exhausting. But as student activists, regardless of that fact, we'll always pick up the slack and we'll always do what is needed. It's just sometimes we just might say the hell with all of this and sleep for that night, but we'll be back in the morning.
So cool to hear that your last institution did actually start paying students. That's phenomenal. I would say that I do a lot of student activism work on Northeastern's campus, and one of the most it is overwhelming, but I also feel like personally it is like the work that I am called to do. Like I feel a personal responsibility to be doing all of the different mutual aid and like sexual health advocacy research work that I do on campus. But like the like drawback, the thing that makes it most exhausting is that like half the time we can't get a seat at the table. We're not taken seriously by administration. We're shut down, like mocked, not taken seriously for the work we're doing. So I think that like adds a level of overwhelmingness. But yeah, no, I definitely spend more time doing student activism work than like honestly work for classes. So it's an interesting balance.
Yeah, I just want to echo what some of the other students said about burnout. I think students aren't just, they want to be activists, but there's so many things to be activists about that now. There's like climate change, there's race, there's a billion issues that I want to care about and I want to do something for, and it's just exhausting because you can't like do everything. And so I know personally, like I've just tried to focus on like how I can personally affect change and like focus on one specific area and dedicate my resources there. I think for my friends who are more activists, like I have friends who are in like really active in the Sunrise Movement at Northeastern, because it's part of a club for them. It's easier because like it's being an activist is also part of seeing their friends daily, and that makes things easier. And my last point is I think to have the time to be an activist takes a lot of privilege. I think paying students is a great way to make that easier. But I think part of the reason like Black Lives Matter like really became so big last year is because so many people had time, like you guys said, during the pandemic. And most people just don't have that kind of time. And the people who do have that time are often the people who are the most privileged, the people who, frankly, we don't need to hear as much from. We need to hear more from those underprivileged communities. But those are the ones who are busy. They don't have time to think about this. So we need to find a way to make it worth their time.
Yeah, in a similar vein, I think the expectations of people of our generation are rising every day. It's not enough to just be a student, maybe have a part-time job. There are so many professional development opportunities available to us, so many extracurricular opportunities that, that all of us the pressure is on 24/7, and then it becomes, when I find the time, I'll, write this letter. When I have the time, I'll write this email, and you just never have the time. And it's been really interesting to see, I guess people of our generation and the labor shortage going on right now, putting their foot down for, working conditions that just don't work for anyone. So I'd be really interested to see, at what point will that come to education? At what point will students stand up for themselves and say, professors, I just can't do this. Administration, we just can't do this, and we're not even going to entertain the idea of participating.
Yeah, and like listening to everyone, I agree with everyone, and I think that social media plays like a really large role in all of this, especially like when comparing generations, because the burnout that people feel, and I think the burnout that I feel is way different than from other students. But we like go to class and maybe we're in a lot of classes like this. So you're learning and talking about hard topics that are draining, emotionally draining during the day. And then like you go and like look on your phone, then you're just seeing like the same thing. And I think that it was not the same for people before they had Instagram and Twitter and all these things that they are just constantly being updated on and how terrible the world is. And so I think that plays a really big role. I also think it plays a big role in keeping people, like, as much as you might feel burnout, you might also feel this responsibility. And it's why people our age are so good at this like social activism that you were talking about. And I do think it's really interesting because like for at least like during the George Floyd like 2020 summer, I was like really angry with my parents for not being as worked up about it as I was. And my dad in like this one moment was like really upset. And he was like, I used to be like you, like during college, like I was like as worked up about all these things. And like, I don't know what happened, but now I'm just like, I got so cynical and I'm like, why am I not, just don't try anymore. And I think that's also a big part of it is like, this is what capitalism does to you. And I think a lot more people our age are seeing that now, that like this idea of working 9 to 5 or even longer than that every day takes all your time. And he's someone in a position of power, like you were saying, like he has more time than other people to think about these things. But in general, the way that our world works is that you go to work all day, all of your life, and you don't question anything and you don't fight back against anything, even if you want to, until you're so tired that you can't even try anymore.
I mean, I think this is really powerful and really interesting. The two things I would mention, one is, we were talking before the panel came on about technology and science. And one of the things, all the things that galvanized 2020, cell phones, right? Social media. I mean, this is technology that has actually had a positive effect. We know a lot of the negative effects. And so your generation is so digitally native and savvy with technology. I wonder if the organizing, which say for the civil rights movement came out of the black churches and the anti-Vietnam protests came out of other kinds of organizing, whether, we've been such critics of hashtag activism, but there are ways in which all the technological changes maybe can be harnessed. I think accountability is a big issue. And one of the things, even here at Northeastern, I've seen where students who understand how to harness Twitter have been able to hold the administration to account, right? The president may not see you. You don't have to occupy his office. They're very good at that. But I know students who have mounted Twitter campaigns and gotten the university to change things because that's something that the university is scared of. So I think the technology might be something where you have an advantage. I also think in a way, in hindsight, we can always say, well, these were the changes, right? The civil rights movement had its roots in all these things that were happening beforehand, the gay rights movement, the women's movement. I wonder when you were talking about work and capitalism, the Amazon fights, the $15 an hour fights, the I'm not going to go to work 5 days a week argument that, privileged people can do. I wonder if that's something when you say people are going to look back at this time, if something is churning there. And I think part of it may be that we as, adults want you to fight for our causes, right? But in the end, you're going to fight for your causes. And maybe what we're seeing now is kind of a gelling that, your generation is figuring out, well, we care about these things. We don't necessarily care about what my parents or grandparents cared about. And maybe that's we're at the beginning stage of that process.
Yeah, I guess like what everybody said about the burnout. And also I feel like, I don't know what student activism is like that well up here. But back home, there was always this issue where it kind of like turned into sort of like pissing contest to see who was like the most woke. Partially because people knew that like if they were activists, they would get into college more easily because it'd be like, oh, look, I'm an extracurricular. I did a thing one time. Yeah. But I feel like we kind of have to get that like competitive thing out of our minds if we want to actually create social change, because it's like not about us personally, it's about us as a collective. That's one thing. Like, ask for help. Don't be annoying about it. Like, things like that.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for everything you've been doing the last couple of years. And I want to acknowledge something that doesn't get acknowledged often enough, which is that young people are coming through 2 hellish years and things are not back to normal, and it is exhausting and it is difficult. And for many of you, that does include, on top of everything else, carrying the burden of trying to respond to climate change and racism and, right? That whole list of things. And so just a couple of things to share, again, recognizing that among those things I listed earlier, I did say middle age, and I understand that it is really important for adults to learn how actually to support youth activists, right? And that is not coming as, oh, back when we were doing this, it was like this. It's different. And so the notion that your age, it does not disqualify you from leading, I think is really an important one to remember. I also want to really emphasize this notion of self-care. I was reminded recently that self-care is a form of community service. Self-care, self-care, self-care. Celebrate your youth. You can get away with stuff now that you're not going to be able to get away with when you're older. So like, do it. Like, go do the silly, the crazy. Don't get in too much trouble. But like, I think it's hugely important to remember to find joy and to be in relationships with community and to do all of those things. And I don't think that activism is sustainable unless it is with community, and that you learn how to do it, right? There's so many opportunities out there to learn how to do this from people who are just your near peers. I think like looking to near peers is a really powerful way to not look to elders necessarily, but to folks you can relate to and who have most recently been in your positions. Because we do ask too much of you, but at the end of the day, it is your futures to shape as you would like, not as we would. And I encourage you to feel empowered to do that and to take care of yourselves along the way.
Closing thoughts?
I also wonder if this notion of activism is big. Like when I hear you all, it's like, did I go out in March? Did I mount this campaign? Did I start an organization? I think there are really small things that you can do on an individual level that make big impacts. And we've alluded to some of them. So I mentioned, having the courage to speak up to a faculty member and say, this thing happened in the class and this is how I felt about it, and can we have a conversation or something like that. Those things, that knowledge that person now has is huge and could mean that the next person doesn't have to experience that thing. So I think along with self-care, this idea of, what little things am I doing that can have a big impact.
I also want to say I very much appreciate how everything that you've shared and where it comes from, and I respect you, and I really appreciate all of the work and the difficulties you've all been through as young people, and all that you've seen and have to live in a very short amount of time in your lives. And I want to say that I was you 20 years ago, too busy getting ready to be a professional to do certain things, and burned out and said, I need to focus on myself. And that's okay too. I have more power now because I made certain choices to, sort of advance my life in a way that maybe my parents were not able to. And it's important that you remember that later and that you use that power for transformative change when you recognize that you've acquired a certain position of power. So give yourself some grace and some forgiveness when you can't do everything. Do what you can. You know, it's the small things. It's the comment that someone made that you call them on. It's the moment when you see something and you want to speak up. It's simply helping, taking care of each other, and supporting each other, and supporting and elevating those that do have the energy to do those things, etc. So you can do the small things and the big things, and every person has a role in life to, you know, to change things. But do always keep these things in mind when you have power, and when you get to a certain position where you can do something. Always check with yourself, you know, what else can I do? Am I in a better place now to do this? So just remember that, and, you know, give yourself some time to.
I'll take a somewhat contrarian view and say that I do think we ask a lot of you. And some might argue it's too much, but that's our job. It's our responsibility to incentivize you to use the energy and intellect that you have now, and to find the ways of working that energy and intellect into your everyday lives so that it reflects your values. Because if you don't figure out how to do that now, it's going to be really hard for you to do that 10 or 15 years from now. I mean, what you're doing now is shaping that person you're going to be as a person who has values and expresses them. If you were athletes and you were on intramural teams, you would be burned out too, but you would feel as though you had the time to go out and play squash as an athlete. And this is the same. If being a person who is a leader, as people who come out of this university, out of Northeastern University, graduate as leaders, if that means, among other things, expressing your values and finding the way to do that, even as you do all of the other things. I mean, I have to say, and you know, I hate going back, but those civil rights people, they felt burned out too. And you talk about anxiety, they felt the anxiety that if they didn't do well in school, they would leave school, get drafted, get sent to Vietnam, and maybe get killed. So the anxieties have been around for a long time. The question is, how do you build the expression of your values into your everyday life? How do you, when you're in the corporate environment, think of yourself the way our new mayor, Michelle Wu, does? Here is a mom with 2 kids and a whole set of obligations, who has just become, at the age of 36, mayor of Boston. We can talk about what it's like for us to be burned out, but think about the task that she is setting for herself as a person who is a person of values, who has been called upon by the rest of us to lead. And it's not that we have to give our whole life to this. You only need to give that portion of your life that matters when you're called upon to serve. This is about service and the expression of values. And every one of us here has been challenged at one point or another to figure out how to build that into our lives, even when we're tired, but to build it into our lives so when the key moments come, we're ready. And that's what we're asking you to learn in this class and in this university. So with that, thank you all for coming tonight.